I watched through my kitchen window as the familiar white SUV barreled across my pasture for the third time that week, cutting deep ruts into the grass I'd spent 2 years cultivating. My coffee mug paused halfway to my lips as I processed what I was seeing. The vehicle wasn't even trying to be subtle about it anymore. Just driving straight through like my property was some kind of public thoroughfare. My name is Xavier Eckhart, and I own a modest 15-acre property in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where I raise a small herd of highland cattle and maintain what used to be a pristine pasture. The property had been in my family for 3 generations, passed down from my grandfather who'd worked this land his entire life. When I inherited it 5 years ago, I'd quit my job in Philadelphia and moved out here full-time, determined to honor his legacy and live a quieter life. The problem started about 6 months ago when the Meadowbrook Heights HOA formed in the new development adjacent to my property. Before that, it had just been open farmland on that side, owned by old Tom Patterson, who'd never bothered anyone. But Tom sold to a developer, and within 18 months, they'd crammed 40 cookie-cutter houses onto what used to be his 100 acres. With the houses came the homeowners, and with the homeowners came the HOA. I pulled on my boots and headed outside, determined to catch whoever was taking this liberty with my land. The morning air was crisp, typical for early March in Pennsylvania, and I could see my breath as I jogged toward where the SUV had disappeared. My property bordered the HOA development on the eastern side, separated by an old fence line that I'd maintained with wooden posts and wire. It wasn't fancy, but it clearly marked the boundary. As I approached the fence, I saw exactly what I'd suspected. Someone had taken down an entire section, posts and all, creating a gap wide enough for vehicles to pass through. The tire tracks led straight from the HOA's main road, across my pasture, and connected to County Road 47 on the opposite side of my property. They'd essentially created a shortcut that saved them probably 5 minutes of driving around the proper way. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The damage was extensive. Deep ruts scarred the pasture where vehicles had been driving through repeatedly. My grass, which I'd carefully maintained for grazing, was torn up and muddy. I could see at least 3 different sets of tire tracks, meaning multiple vehicles had been using this unauthorized route. My phone buzzed. It was my neighbor to the west, Frank Morrison, a dairy farmer who'd been dealing with his own HOA issues. "You see them cutting through again?" he asked when I answered. "I'm standing in the tracks right now. They took down my whole fence section." Frank sighed. "They tried to cite me last week for having a manure smell, said it was affecting their property values. I told them they moved next to a working farm. What did they expect?" "Who's running this HOA?" "Woman named Helen Carmichael. Real piece of work. She's been president since they formed." "You haven't met her yet?" "Not formally. I've avoided the whole situation." "Well, you're about to get formally acquainted. She doesn't take no for an answer." After I hung up with Frank, I spent the next hour documenting everything. I measured the gap in my fence, photographed the tire tracks from multiple angles, and even found where someone had tossed the fence posts into the brush at the edge of my property. They hadn't just driven through an opening. They'd actively dismantled my fence to create their shortcut. I was heading back to the house when I heard a car approaching. A white sedan pulled up my driveway, and a woman in her late 40s stepped out. She was wearing a crisp blazer despite it being Saturday morning, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she carried a leather folder under her arm. "Mr. Eckhart," she called out, not waiting for me to reach her before she started talking. "I'm Helen Carmichael, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your property maintenance." I stopped walking and stared at her. "Excuse me." "Your cattle are an eyesore, and we've received multiple complaints about the smell. The Meadowbrook Heights community standards require all adjacent properties to maintain certain aesthetic guidelines." I felt my jaw tighten. "Madam, I don't live in your HOA. My property isn't subject to your rules." She waved her hand dismissively. "Your property directly impacts our residents' quality of life and property values. We're prepared to offer you a reasonable solution. If you agree to relocate your livestock to the western section of your property, away from our development, we'll drop the matter." "And what if I don't?" Helen's expression hardened. "Then we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. We have rights, Mr. Eckhart." "Funny you should mention rights," I said, pulling out my phone and showing her the photos. "Because someone's been using my property as a personal highway. Any idea who that might be?" She barely glanced at the phone. "That's the access easement. It's been there for years." "There's no easement on my property. I've got the deed and survey right inside my house." "Well, perhaps you should review your documents more carefully. Now, about the cattle, get off my property." Helen's face flushed red. "I'm trying to be reasonable here." "No, you're trying to bully me into doing what you want. I'm telling you right now, there's no easement. There's never been an easement, and whoever's been cutting through my land needs to stop immediately. I've got damage to my pasture and my fence that I'll be billing someone for." "We'll see about that," Helen said, turning sharply and marching back to her car. She peeled out of my driveway fast enough to spray gravel. I went inside and pulled out my property documents. I'd reviewed them dozens of times when I inherited the place, and I knew every detail. There was absolutely no easement granting anyone the right to cross my property. The deed was clear, and the survey I'd had done 3 years ago when I put in a new well confirmed the boundaries exactly. That afternoon, I drove into Lancaster and stopped at Harrison Hardware. Old Bill Harrison had owned the place for 40 years and knew everyone in the county. "Xavier," he greeted me warmly, "what brings you in?" "I need supplies to put up a gate, a serious one." Bill raised his eyebrows, having trouble. I explained the situation while he helped me pick out materials. I settled on a heavy-duty steel farm gate, 12 feet wide, with a serious chain and padlock system. Bill threw in some concrete mix and helped me load everything into my truck. "Those HOA types can be nasty," Bill said. "My sister lives in one over in York. They fined her for painting her front door the wrong shade of blue. Not kidding. This one's claiming there's an easement on my property that doesn't exist. You check with the county recorder." That's my next stop. The Lancaster County Recorder of Deeds office was open until 4 on Saturdays. I made it with 20 minutes to spare. The clerk, a patient older woman named Martha, helped me pull up all the historical records for my property going back 50 years. "No easements," she confirmed, adjusting her glasses. "Nothing recorded here that would give anyone the right to cross your land. See, your property's clear except for the utility easement along the road, which is standard. Can I get certified copies of everything?" "Absolutely." "Give me about 10 minutes." I left the recorder's office with a thick folder of documents, all officially stamped and certified. Whatever Helen Carmichael thought she had, I now had definitive proof that she was wrong. Sunday morning, I got up at dawn and spent 6 hours installing the gate. The ground was still partially frozen, which made digging the post holes a challenge, but I managed. I set the posts in concrete, hung the gate, and attached a heavy-duty chain with a padlock. Then I put up clear signs on both sides. "Private property, no trespassing, no easement exists." I was admiring my work when I heard an engine approaching from the HOA side. The same white SUV from before came barreling across my pasture, heading straight for the gate. I stepped aside and waited. The SUV screeched to a halt about 10 feet from the gate. A man in his 30s jumped out, his face already red with anger. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. "Private property gate. Can I help you? You can't just block the access road. It's not an access road. It's my pasture. I use this route every day to get to work." "Then you've been trespassing every day. Time to use the public roads like everyone else." The man pulled out his phone and made a call. I caught enough of the conversation to know he was calling Helen. He paced back and forth, gesturing angrily, then shoved his phone back in his pocket. "Helen's on her way. You're going to regret this." I shrugged and leaned against my truck, which I'd parked strategically to make it clear I wasn't going anywhere. The man got back in his SUV and did a sloppy three-point turn, tearing up more of my pasture in the process. I took more photos. Helen arrived 15 minutes later in her white sedan, followed by 2 other cars. She stepped out with 3 other people, 2 women and a man, all looking equally irritated. "Mr. Eckhart," Helen said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Remove this gate immediately." "No. You're blocking established access. This gate constitutes harassment and interference with our community's reasonable use of established pathways." I pulled out my folder. "I've got certified documents from the county recorder showing no easement exists on this property. I've got photos of the damage to my pasture and my fence. What you've been doing is criminal trespassing, and it stops now." One of the other women, a blonde in yoga pants, stepped forward. "We've been using this route for months. You can't just suddenly block it." "Actually, I can. It's called property rights." "This is ridiculous," the man with them said. "It's just a shortcut. Why are you being so difficult? Why are you driving across someone else's property without permission?" I countered. Helen held up her hand to quiet the others. "Mr. Eckhart, let's be reasonable adults here. The community is willing to offer compensation for the inconvenience. We could perhaps arrange a small monthly fee in exchange for access. Not interested. We could also reconsider our concerns about your livestock." "I don't recall asking for your approval of my livestock." Helen's expression turned cold. "You're making a very big mistake. Our community has resources, Mr. Eckhart. We have lawyers, we have political connections, and we have 40 families who vote in every local election. You're one person with a failing cattle operation. Think very carefully about whether you want to make enemies of us. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Remove the gate or face the consequences. Get off my property, all of you." They left, but Helen's expression promised this wasn't over. I watched them drive away, then spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the fence line on both sides of the gate. I wasn't taking any chances. Monday morning, I got a visit from the sheriff's deputy. Deputy Michaels was a young guy I'd met a few times at the local diner. "Morning, Xavier," he said, looking apologetic. "Got a complaint I need to follow up on. Helen Carmichael from Meadowbrook Heights says you've erected a structure that's blocking a legal easement." I handed him my folder. "There's no easement. County records confirm it. They've been trespassing, I documented it, and I installed a gate on my own property." Deputy Michaels reviewed the documents carefully. "These look pretty definitive." "Because they are. Check with the county yourself if you want." "There's no easement, never has been." "Mind if I take a look at the gate?" "Not at all." We drove over in his patrol car. Deputy Michaels examined the gate, the fence line, and the damage to my pasture. He took his own photos and made notes. "Looks like they really tore up your land," he observed. "Multiple vehicles, multiple times. I've got dates and photos going back 2 weeks, but Frank Morrison says they've been doing it longer. I'll include this in my report. For what it's worth, you're within your rights to gate your own property. If they want to claim an easement exists, they need to prove it in court. After Deputy Michaels left, I felt slightly more confident. At least law enforcement wasn't automatically siding with the HOA. That confidence lasted until Wednesday, when I received a certified letter from a law firm in Lancaster. The letter, signed by an attorney named Patricia Walsh, informed me that I was in violation of an implied easement based on established use, and that I had 5 days to remove the gate or face legal action. I called my own attorney, Robert Chen, whom I'd used for the estate work when I inherited the property. Robert listened to everything, reviewed the photos I emailed him, and asked me to bring in all my documents, an implied easement based on established use. Robert said when we met Thursday afternoon, "That's a stretch. Pennsylvania law does recognize prescriptive easements, but the use has to be open, notorious, continuous, and adverse for 21 years. You're saying this has been going on for 6 months, at most. The development wasn't even there a year ago. Then they have no legal basis, but they're clearly hoping you'll back down rather than fight. I'm not backing down. Good, I'll draft a response. This is actually pretty straightforward. They're trespassing, you've documented it, and you've taken reasonable steps to protect your property. If they want to push this, we'll countersue for the damage to your pasture and fence." Robert sent his response Friday afternoon. I figured that would buy me some peace for at least a few days. I was wrong. Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of engines. I looked out my window and saw 5 vehicles lined up at my gate. People were out of their cars and someone was attacking the gate with bolt cutters. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911 and ran outside. "Stop!" I shouted. "I've called the sheriff." A man I didn't recognize, probably in his 50s, turned to face me. "This gate is illegal and we're removing it. It's my property and you're all trespassing. There are cameras recording everything." I was bluffing about the cameras, but they didn't know that. "We have rights." A woman screamed from one of the cars. Helen emerged from her sedan, looking calmer than the others. "Mr. Eckhart, this has gone far enough. We're simply exercising our legal right to access. You have no legal right. Your own attorney is making baseless claims, and you're now committing criminal mischief by attempting to destroy my property." The sound of sirens cut through the morning air. Deputy Michaels arrived with another deputy I didn't recognize. Both officers got out of their patrol cars and assessed the situation quickly. "What's going on here?" Deputy Michaels asked. Everyone started talking at once. Michaels held up his hand and pointed at me. "Xavier, you first." I woke up to these people attempting to cut down the gate on my property. I called 911 immediately. Michaels turned to Helen. "Madam, we're removing an illegal structure that's blocking our access route. Do you have documentation proving you have a legal easement?" "We're pursuing that through the courts, but in the meantime, so you don't have documentation." Michaels looked at the other deputy. "We've got attempted criminal mischief, maybe criminal trespass. Mr. Eckhart has clear documentation showing this is his property with no easement." "This is harassment," one of the other women yelled. "We've done nothing wrong." The other deputy, whose nameplate read Torres, stepped forward. "Actually, madam, attempting to destroy someone's property is definitely wrong. Everyone needs to leave this property immediately, or you'll be cited for trespassing." "I want to file charges," I said. "They've admitted to repeatedly trespassing, they've caused significant property damage, and now they've attempted to destroy my gate." Deputy Michaels nodded. "That's your right. I'll need detailed statements from everyone." It took 2 hours to sort everything out. The deputies documented the attempted bolt cutter damage to my gate's chain, took statements from multiple HOA members who essentially admitted to regular trespassing. and issued citations to the man with the bolt cutters for attempted criminal mischief. Helen maintained her icy composure throughout, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. This wasn't going the way she'd planned. After everyone left, Deputy Michaels pulled me aside. "You should really install actual cameras. I wasn't kidding about the harassment potential here." Already on my list. And Xavier, watch your back. HOAs can get nasty when they don't get their way. That afternoon, I drove back to Harrison Hardware and bought a complete security camera system. Bill helped me pick out 4 wireless cameras with night vision and motion detection. I spent Sunday installing them at strategic points around the gate and along the fence line, all recording to a cloud storage system. Monday brought another letter, this time directly from Helen Carmichael's HOA board. The letter informed me that I was being assessed a fine of $500 per day for obstruction of community access, and that the HOA would place a lien on my property if the fines weren't paid. I forwarded it to Robert immediately. He called me back within an hour, and he was laughing. "They can't do that. You're not a member of their HOA. They have absolutely no authority to fine you or place liens on your property. This is completely baseless." So I ignore it. I'll respond officially, but yes, ignore it. In fact, this helps our case. They're now engaging in harassment and making fraudulent threats. Keep every piece of paper they send you. The week that followed was tense but quiet. My cameras caught several cars driving up to the gate, pausing, and then turning around. I watched the footage each evening, noting license plates and times. The pattern was clear. Multiple HOA residents had been regularly using my property as a shortcut, and they were angry about losing that convenience. On Friday evening, Frank Morrison called. "You hear about the HOA meeting?" "What meeting?" "Emergency session tonight at 7. Helen's talking about taking collective action against you. Thought you should know." "How'd you find out?" "My niece lives in Meadowbrook Heights. She's not happy with Helen either. Says the HOA's gotten too aggressive." "Anyway, figured you'd want a heads up." I thanked Frank and spent some time thinking about what collective action might mean. Nothing good, probably. At 9:30 that night, my security system sent me an alert. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and saw headlights approaching the gate. Not just one vehicle this time, but at least a dozen. Cars and trucks lined up along my fence line and people were getting out. I grabbed my phone and my truck keys. As I drove toward the gate, I dialed 911 again. By the time I arrived, there were at least 30 people gathered near my gate. Someone had brought floodlights powered by a generator. Others had tools, shovels, even a come-along winch system. "Everyone stop," I shouted, parking my truck sideways to block the gate from the inside. "You're all trespassing, and I've called the sheriff." Helen pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Eckhart, this community has voted unanimously to reclaim our access route. Your obstruction is unreasonable and malicious, and we won't tolerate it any longer." "You can't vote to trespass on someone else's property. That's not how property rights work." "We have rights too," someone shouted from the crowd. "Yeah, who do you think you are?" Another voice called. The crowd was getting agitated, pressing closer. I stood my ground on my side of the gate, but I was acutely aware that I was one person facing down 30 angry HOA members. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. This time it wasn't just Deputy Michaels. 4 patrol cars arrived, along with a sergeant I recognized from the county fair, Sergeant Patricia Alvarez. "Everyone step back," Sergeant Alvarez commanded in a voice that didn't invite argument. "This is private property and you're all trespassing. We're exercising our rights." Helen insisted, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. Sergeant Alvarez walked up to Helen. "Madam, I've reviewed the reports from the previous incidents. Mr. Eckhart has documented proof that this is his property with no easement. You've been repeatedly told to stop trespassing. This is now becoming a pattern of criminal behavior. This is ridiculous. We're tax-paying citizens who just want reasonable access to someone else's property without permission. That's called trespassing. Alvarez gestured to the other deputies. I want IDs from everyone here. Anyone who refuses to leave will be charged with criminal trespass. Anyone who's participated in previous incidents will be cited. Anyone who touches that gate or fence will be arrested for criminal mischief. The crowd's energy shifted quickly. People started backing toward their vehicles, suddenly interested in leaving. A few tried to argue, but the deputies were methodical, taking names and issuing citations to anyone who'd been involved in the previous incidents. Helen was one of the last to leave, and Sergeant Alvarez stopped her specifically. Mrs. Carmichael, you've organized multiple incidents of criminal trespass on this property. If this continues, you'll be charged with more serious crimes. Do you understand? You can't intimidate me. Our HOA has rights. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over property that doesn't belong to your members. Continue this behavior and you'll face criminal charges and civil liability. That's not a threat, that's a promise. After everyone left, Sergeant Alvarez stayed behind to talk with me. You've got a good case for a restraining order if you want one. Will it help? Can't hurt. Judge Bradford handles these cases, and she doesn't have much patience for HOA overreach. I'd recommend filing Monday morning. I will. Thank you for responding so quickly. We take property rights seriously in this county. That crowd was close to becoming a mob. Good thing you had cameras. I spent the weekend reviewing all my camera footage and organizing my documentation. Robert helped me prepare a petition for a restraining order against Helen Carmichael and the Meadowbrook Heights HOA board specifically. We filed Monday morning at the Lancaster County Courthouse. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Judge Elizabeth Bradford was a stern woman in her 60s who ran her courtroom with precision. Helen appeared with attorney Patricia Walsh, the same lawyer who'd sent the initial threatening letter. Robert presented our case methodically. He showed the certified county documents proving no easement existed, displayed photos and videos of the repeated trespassing, and highlighted the escalating pattern of harassment, including the attempted mob action Friday night. Attorney Walsh argued that the situation was merely a misunderstanding between neighbors and that a restraining order was excessive. She claimed the HOA members had genuinely believed an easement existed based on the previous landowner's verbal permission. Judge Bradford cut her off. Counselor, the previous landowner sold his property 2 years ago. The current landowner has clearly documented ownership and has explicitly denied permission for anyone to cross his property. Your clients have been informed of this repeatedly by both the property owner and law enforcement, yet the trespassing continues and has escalated to mob action. That's not a misunderstanding, that's criminal harassment. Your Honor, if I may, you may not. I've seen enough HOA overreach cases to recognize the pattern. Mr. Eckhart has proven clear and repeated violations of his property rights. Judge Bradford looked directly at Helen. Mrs. Carmichael, you and your entire HOA board are hereby enjoined from entering Mr. Eckhart's property for any reason. You are prohibited from contacting him directly. Any communication must go through attorneys. You will also pay for all damages to his property, to be calculated and submitted within 30 days. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest for contempt. Do you understand? Helen's face was red, but she nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office to review whether criminal charges are warranted for the organized trespass and attempted property destruction. After the hearing, Robert and I grabbed coffee at a shop near the courthouse. "That went about as well as we could have hoped," he said. "Bradford's order is solid, and the DA referral might actually lead somewhere. Will they really prosecute? Maybe. Lancaster County has had issues with aggressive HOAs before. The DA's office might see this as an opportunity to send a message." 2 weeks later, I received notice that the district attorney was indeed pursuing charges. Helen Carmichael was charged with criminal conspiracy, criminal trespass, and attempted criminal mischief. 3 HOA board members were charged with criminal trespass and conspiracy. Several other HOA members who'd participated in multiple incidents received misdemeanor trespass charges. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly, my quiet property dispute became a much bigger issue. A reporter from Lancaster Online called me for an interview. "This seems like an extreme case of HOA overreach," the reporter, Jessica Kim, said. "What do you think motivated such aggressive behavior?" "Honestly, entitlement. They wanted something that wasn't theirs, and they convinced themselves they had a right to it. When I said no, they couldn't accept it." The article ran the next day with the headline, "Lancaster HOA faces criminal charges after repeated trespassing." It included photos of my torn-up pasture and the attempted bolt cutter damage to my gate. The comments section exploded with hundreds of responses, mostly from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. The publicity had an unexpected effect. I received calls from 3 different property owners in the area who'd had similar issues with the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. One woman, Sarah Martinez, told me the HOA had been trying to force her to remove a barn on her property that predated their development by 50 years. "They claim it's an eyesore," Sarah said, "but it's a historical structure that's been here since 1920. I've been fighting them for a year." "Have you talked to a lawyer?" "I can't afford one. I'm a retired teacher on a fixed income." I gave her Robert Chen's contact information and told him to mention my name. Robert later called to thank me for the referral and told me he was taking Sarah's case pro bono because he was tired of HOA bullies. The criminal cases moved forward slowly, as legal cases do. But in early May, about 2 months after the restraining order, I got a call from the assistant district attorney handling the prosecutions. "Mr. Eckhart, this is Ada Marcus Williams. I wanted to update you on the status of the charges. Mrs. Carmichael and the other defendants have approached us about a plea agreement." "What kind of agreement?" "They're willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, community service, full restitution to you for damages, and formal dissolution of their positions on the HOA board. They'd also agree to permanent restrictions preventing them from serving in any HOA leadership role in the future. No jail time. These are first-time offenders, and while their behavior was certainly serious, it didn't rise to the level where incarceration would typically be warranted. However, the guilty pleas would give them criminal records, and the financial restitution would be significant." "How much restitution?" "Our estimate, based on the agricultural consultant's report, is around $12,000. That covers pasture restoration, fence replacement, and your time and expenses." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to push for harsher penalties, but another part just wanted this whole situation to be over. What about the other HOA members who were charged? They'd receive similar deals proportional to their involvement. Anyone who physically damaged property would also face steeper fines and more community service hours. All right, I can accept that on one condition. What's that? I want a recorded apology from Mrs. Carmichael, formally acknowledging that there was never any easement and that their behavior was wrong, something that goes in the court record. I can make that part of the plea agreement. The plea hearing was scheduled for late May. The courtroom was packed, not just with the defendants but with other residents of Meadowbrook Heights and property owners from the surrounding area who'd been following the case. Judge Bradford presided again. She went through each defendant individually, making sure they understood the terms of their plea agreements. When it was Helen's turn, she stood and addressed the court in a voice that was nothing like her previous confident tone. Your Honor, I want to apologize to Mr. Eckhart for my behavior and the behavior of those I led. We were wrong. There was never any easement on his property. We trespassed repeatedly, we damaged his land, and we attempted to intimidate him into giving us something we had no right to. I accept full responsibility for my actions and the actions I encouraged in others. Judge Bradford nodded. Mrs. Carmichael, HOAs serve an important function in many communities, but that function does not extend beyond their jurisdiction. You used your position of leadership to organize criminal activity against a property owner who was simply exercising his legal rights. You're fortunate that Mr. Eckhart is willing to accept this plea agreement rather than pushing for a trial. Sentenced as agreed, 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, joint and several liability for $12,000 in restitution, and permanent removal from any HOA leadership position. Next, the other defendants received similar sentences proportional to their involvement. The man with the bolt cutters got an additional fine and anger management classes. After the hearing, Jessica Kim from Lancaster Online approached me outside the courthouse. How do you feel about the outcome? Satisfied. I didn't start this fight, but I wasn't going to back down from it either. Property rights matter, and no HOA has the authority to override those rights. What's next for you? Back to farming. I've got a pasture to restore and cattle to tend. That's all I wanted in the first place. The restitution check arrived in early June, just as I was finishing repairs to my pasture. I'd hired a landscaping company to properly restore the areas that had been damaged, and the fence line was rebuilt stronger than before. My gate remained, now supplemented by additional fencing and an upgraded lock system. Life gradually returned to normal. My Highland cattle grazed peacefully, no longer disturbed by vehicles cutting through their pasture. The security cameras remained, just in case, but they mostly recorded deer and the occasional fox. In July, I got an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her 30s pulled up my driveway in a small sedan and got out nervously. Mr. Eckhart, I'm Danielle Pearson. I live in Meadowbrook Heights. I tensed slightly, but her body language was apologetic, not aggressive. What can I do for you? I wanted to thank you, actually. A group of us formed a new HOA board after Helen and the others were removed. We've been working to undo a lot of the aggressive policies they'd put in place. Your case helped us realize how out of control things had gotten. I appreciate that. We're also working with neighboring property owners to establish better relationships. We know the development changed things around here, but we don't want to be bad neighbors. That's good to hear. Danielle handed me a folder. This is a formal acknowledgement from the new HOA board that there is no easement on your property and a commitment that no HOA member will trespass on your land. We're also planning a community meeting next month to discuss how we can better coexist with the farms in the area. Would you be willing to attend and maybe share your perspective? I looked at the document. It was professionally prepared and signed by all 5 new board members. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. Again, I'm really sorry for what you went through." After Danielle left, I sat on my porch with a beer and looked out over my pasture. The grass was green again, the ruts were gone, and my cattle were contentedly grazing in the evening light. It had been a hell of a few months, but in the end my property remained mine. My rights had been upheld, and maybe, just maybe, some people had learned an important lesson about respecting boundaries. Frank Morrison called later that evening. "Heard the new HOA board visited you. News travels fast. Small county, what do you think?" "I think they're trying. Whether it lasts, who knows, but at least they're making an effort. Better than Helen's crew. You hear she and her husband are moving. Can't say I'm surprised." "Yeah, apparently having a criminal record and being the face of an HOA scandal wasn't great for her real estate business." "Who knew?" I laughed despite myself. "Karma's real." I did end up attending the community meeting in August. About 50 people showed up, a mix of HOA members and neighboring property owners. The new board had organized a respectful discussion about how to balance community standards with rural life. Several farmers, including Frank, spoke about the realities of agricultural operations. HOA members asked questions, most of them genuine rather than confrontational. At one point, a young couple with kids asked about the Highland cattle. "Are they dangerous? Our kids play in the backyard and we can see them from our fence." "Highland cattle are actually one of the gentler breeds," I explained. "They're used to humans, and mine are particularly docile, but they're still large animals, so your kids should never try to approach them or reach through a fence. Respect their space, and they'll respect yours." The couple nodded, seeming satisfied. It was such a contrast to Helen's aggressive demands that I removed them entirely. The meeting ended with a set of agreed-upon guidelines. HOA members would respect property boundaries. Agricultural operations would maintain reasonable noise and odor management where possible. And both sides would communicate directly about concerns rather than escalating to confrontation. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. By autumn, the whole situation felt like a distant memory. My pasture was fully restored, actually healthier than it had been before thanks to the professional landscaping work the restitution had funded. I'd even added some additional acreage to my grazing rotation using part of the settlement money. The gate remained, but I rarely saw anyone approach it anymore. The occasional car would drive up, realize they needed to take the long way around, and turn back without incident. The security cameras recorded nothing more interesting than wildlife. In October, I received a letter from Sarah Martinez, the woman with the historic barn. She'd won her case against the HOA with Robert's help, and the judge had ruled that her barn was protected as a historic structure. She thanked me for the attorney referral and invited me to a barn restoration celebration she was planning. I went to the celebration on a bright October Saturday. Sarah's barn was beautiful, a classic Pennsylvania bank barn that had been lovingly maintained for over a century. Dozens of people showed up, including some members from Meadowbrook Heights, who'd contributed to a restoration fund the new HOA board had established as a goodwill gesture. Robert Chen was there too, and we talked about how the case had ended up benefiting multiple people beyond just me. "You standing your ground gave other people courage to stand up for their rights too," he said. "That matters. I was just trying to protect my property." Sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. You showed that HOAs aren't invincible and that property rights still mean something. As I drove home that evening, past the Meadowbrook Heights development with its neat rows of houses, I thought about how the whole situation had unfolded. It had started with someone cutting through my pasture, a simple trespass that could have been resolved with a conversation. Instead, It had escalated into criminal charges, court cases, and a complete restructuring of an HOA board. The core issue had never been complicated. My property was mine, and no one had the right to use it without permission. But Helen Carmichael and her board had been so convinced of their own authority that they'd convinced themselves they could override basic property rights. The gate still stood at the edge of my pasture, a steel reminder that boundaries matter and that sometimes you have to fight to protect what's yours. But it also represented something else now. The point where one community started to learn that being neighbors meant respecting each other, not trying to control each other. I pulled into my driveway as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple over my pasture. My highland cattle were silhouetted against the sunset, peaceful and undisturbed. This was what I'd fought for, the right to live my life on my own land, raising my cattle and maintaining my family's legacy without interference from people who thought their convenience mattered more than my rights. The next morning, I was out checking the fence line when a truck pulled up. It was Bill Harrison from the hardware store along with his grandson. "Xavier, got a minute, always." "What's up?" "My grandson here, Tyler, is doing a school project on property rights and local government. When I told him about your situation with the HOA, he wanted to interview you. Would that be okay?" Tyler was maybe 16, holding a notebook and looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Eckhart, I'm studying how citizens can protect their rights against organizations that overstep their authority. Your case seemed like a perfect example." We spent an hour talking while I worked on the fence. I explained the timeline of events, the legal process, and the importance of documentation. Tyler took careful notes and asked smart questions. "What would you tell other people who face similar situations?" he asked. "Document everything. Know your rights. Don't be intimidated by organizations that act like they have more authority than they actually do, and get a good lawyer early before things escalate." "Were you ever scared?" I thought about that night with the mob at my gate. Scared. Maybe a little when 30 people showed up ready to tear down my gate, but more than scared, I was angry. I'd done nothing wrong, and I wasn't going to be bullied into giving up my property rights. Tyler finished his project and apparently got an A. Bill told me later that Tyler had presented it to the school board, and that it had sparked a discussion about teaching property rights and civic responsibility in the local schools. Winter came, and with it, the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. My cattle grew thick winter coats and grazed contentedly on the hay I'd stored in my barn. The pasture lay dormant under occasional snow, but I knew it would come back green and strong in spring, with no tire tracks cutting through it. I stayed in touch with the new Meadowbrook Heights HOA board, not because I had to, but because they'd proven themselves reasonable. When they asked for my input on a proposed walking trail that would run along the public road near my property, I offered suggestions on how to design it to avoid disturbing livestock. When I needed to move cattle across a road that bordered their development, they helped coordinate with residents to ensure everyone stayed safe. It was how neighbors should work, with mutual respect and communication, not demands and trespassing. In December, I received a Christmas card from Danielle Pearson and the new HOA board. Inside was a handwritten note thanking me again for my patience and for giving the new board a chance to prove they were different from the old one. It also included a gift certificate to Harrison Hardware, which made me laugh. I sent back a card with a photo of my Highland cattle in the snow, along with a note. "Here's to good fences making good neighbors. Have a peaceful holiday." On Christmas Eve, I stood at my kitchen window with a mug of hot chocolate, looking out at the same view where this whole situation had started. My gate was there, locked and secure, a clear boundary that everyone now respected. The pasture beyond it was peaceful and undisturbed, exactly as it should be. My phone rang. It was Frank Morrison. "Merry Christmas Eve, Xavier. You doing okay over there?" "Doing just fine, Frank. You can't complain." "Listen, bunch of us farmers are getting together at the diner tomorrow afternoon after folks finish with their family stuff. You should come." "I'll be there." "Good. You've become something of a legend around here, you know. The guy who stood up to the HOA and won." "I just wanted to protect my property." "Yeah, well, you did that and then some. See you tomorrow." After I hung up, I thought about Frank's words. I'd never set out to become any kind of legend or symbol. I'd just been a guy trying to raise cattle on land my grandfather had worked, dealing with trespassers who thought convenience mattered more than property rights. But maybe that was the point. Sometimes the biggest stands you take are just about protecting what's rightfully yours, standing your ground when it would be easier to give in, and insisting that rules and rights apply to everyone equally. The gate had been a simple solution to a straightforward problem. People were crossing my property without permission, so I blocked access. The fact that it had escalated into criminal charges, court cases, and HOA board recalls wasn't my fault. That was on Helen Carmichael and the people who'd followed her, who'd convinced themselves that their wants outweighed someone else's rights. As I settled into my chair that evening, I felt deeply satisfied, not just because I'd won, but because the outcome had been right. Property rights had been upheld, justice had been served, and a community had learned important lessons about boundaries and respect. The gate would remain as long as I owned this property, a permanent reminder that some lines shouldn't be crossed. But I hoped it would also remind people of something more positive, that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, can lead to better outcomes for everyone. My Highland cattle were bedded down for the night, safe in their pasture. The fence line was secure. The gate was locked. And for the first time in months, everything was exactly as it should be. I raised my mug in a silent toast to my grandfather, who taught me that land was more than just property. It was legacy, responsibility, and something worth protecting. He'd fought to keep this farm during the Depression, and I'd fought to keep it free from HOA overreach. Different battles, same principle. This land was ours, and no one had the right to take it or diminish it without permission. The fire crackled in my fireplace, and outside, snow began to fall softly over the pasture. Christmas morning would bring a white landscape, peaceful and pristine, with no tire tracks to mar it. Just open land, grazing cattle, and the knowledge that sometimes the simplest acts, like installing a gate, can have the biggest impacts. I thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this situation. Sarah Martinez, who'd found the courage to fight for her barn, Tyler Harrison, who'd learned about civic responsibility, the HOA members who'd stood up to form a better board, and countless others who'd followed the story and perhaps learned something about standing up for their own rights. All because I'd caught the HOA cutting through my pasture and decided to do something about it. As I headed to bed that night, I took one last look at the gate through my window, illuminated by the security lights I'd installed. It stood solid and permanent, a 12-foot barrier of steel that represented something much larger than itself. Tomorrow would bring Christmas dinner with friends at the diner, and the day after that would bring the normal routines of farm life. The cattle would need feeding, the fences would need checking, and life would continue in its quiet, predictable way. And that was exactly what I'd fought for, the right to live my life on my own terms, on my own land, without interference from people who thought they knew better. The gate had done its job. The HOA had learned its lesson. Justice had been served, and my pasture was mine again, truly and completely mine as it should have been all along.